Hello, and welcome to the Silly History of England Part 2. I'm your dear Uncle Bob Bob, and I work with a very silly group of middle-aged boys called the Silly History Boys. Now, if you listen to Silly History of England Part 1, you'll know that we finished at King Henry V, the famous one from Shakespeare's play. Now, Henry V has a lot to do with the 100 Years' War, which is a very long and very unpleasant battle between the Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of France in the sort of mid-medieval period from, let's say, like the 1350s all the way down to, funny enough, the 1450s, because it's 100 years. That's how long it lasted. So it's quite long, the 100 Years' War. In fact, it was longer than 100 years. It was 116 years. But there's lots of things that people misunderstand a little bit about the 100 Years' War. So I thought we would go a little bit back to some of the history that causes it beforehand. And then the next thing that we'll get onto, because quite frankly, I don't know if we'll have time for anything else, because after the 100 Years' War, there's then the Wars of the Roses. And if you think history is complicated, oh Lord, the Wars of the Roses. It's, for mums and dads, it's what inspired Game of Thrones. Because the narrative is all over the place. It's well worth 8 seasons, but it does wrap up quite nicely in the end, unlike Game of Thrones. So we're probably going to do the 100 Years' War and the Wars of the Roses today, and I doubt we'll have time for anything else. So, without further ado, I give you the Silly History of England, Part 2, Return of Jafar. You'll also wonder why I'm wearing a Wales rugby jersey. It's because my family's Welsh, and to do the Silly History of England, I have to wear my costume. So there you go. Right, okay, you know we're here because we just commented. Yes, it's good to do. My son is going to go on the comments too. Excellent, good, right. Theatre of Science, thank you, Lara. It is time to begin the Silly History of England with a tale of 2 countries. England and France. You may know that England and France have been enemies quite a lot throughout history. If you've seen the Napoleon film, there's a war between England and France in that. If you've seen the Three Musketeers in the past, there's a war between England and France in that. If you know about Joan of Arc, we'll get to her. There's a war between England and France in that. If you know anything about 1066 and all that, you will know that there was a war between French people and English people. So they've been going at it a while. Why is this? Well, they're quite close to each other. And the people who run them, their kings, are quite intermingled. They're quite sort of connected to one another. So the first connection between England and France is, hi cat, is from the invasion of 1066, where William, Duke of Normandy in France, decides, through various reasons that we got to in the Silly History of England Part 1, to invade England. It was a bonjour. It was a bonjour indeed, a good day. Because at the Battle of Hastings, which you may know about, the army of William the Conqueror defeats the army of King Harold of England, Harold Godwinson, and William becomes King William I of England. So, William is French. He also has land in France as well, Normandy, where he's from. And he has other land as well. He's got a lot to do with Brittany, which is in the top left-hand corner of France, and Maine, which is sort of just on the edge of Normandy. And all of William's relatives have connections with this land as well. In fact, his great-great-great-great-grandson, Henry II, owns a huge amount of France. He actually owns more of France than the King of France. And the King of France is a bit jealous about all of Henry II's lands in France. And so there's a scrap over it. There's a series of little wars where the King of France gets Henry's silly sons to rebel against their dad and join their French lands to his. And it's one of the complicated bits of history anyway. But basically, the kings of England have always got a foot in France. And their land in France is very wealthy, and they really want to keep hold of it. But the English king, who eventually goes a long way into losing that land, is poor King John, the baddie in Robin Hood. He is known as England's worst king for a number of different reasons. One, lost a lot of battles. 2, lost all this land in France. 3, was just a jerk. When John visited his subjects in Ireland, he spent all his time making fun of the Irish lords' moustaches because he considered them unfashionable. There is a vicious rumour that John's nephew, Arthur of Brittany, had a better claim to the throne to him, so John hit his head in with a brick while he was chained up in prison. So King John, not a nice man, and not a particularly good king either. You might remember him from the Magna Carta. He was such a rotten king that the nobles of England tried to get him to sign a piece of paper, the Magna Carta, the Great Charter, to give power from the king to Parliament. And that's how bad a king he was. And when he refused to this, they actually invited the French to come and be kings of England instead. Anyway, what happened there is King John ate and drank too many peaches and cider and pooed himself to death. So it wasn't a problem anymore. The English didn't need the French to come and be kings of England anymore, so the French packed off home, a little bit disappointed. Now, John's son, Henry III, became king. And he had problems with his barons as well. And they wanted to get rid of him. And they did get rid of him, actually. They replaced him with a fellow called Simon de Montfort. And Parliament ran England for a bit. You really have to keep your nobles happy if you're going to be king of England. And a good way to keep your nobles distracted is with a big war. And Henry III's son, Edward I, understood this better than most. He's a very warlike king. As a Welshman, I don't think much of him because he conquered the last independent kingdom of Wales, and he delved up all this land in Wales and gave it to his nobles. So his nobles weren't upset with him anymore. They didn't mind about Magna Carta because they had loads of money. And that, if you're a medieval knight or noble, is what you want. Loads of money. Edward then tries this up in Scotland, but it doesn't work quite so well. And then he dies, age 60. He has a good innings. All of this, boys and girls, is covered in the Silly History of England Part 1. But it all relates to what is going to happen. That's the problem with history. It's like a big jumper. Like, you get hold of one thread and you give it a tug. And then before you know it, you are literally covered in jumper. History jumper. It's all interconnected with it. And that's kind of what this little thing is about. We all know little bits of history. But we may not know that all of it is connected. And you don't know how far back those threads go. So you might pull on the little natty bit of your dinosaur jumper. You might unravel the whole thing. And that is what we're going to do. Well, the children, well, then I bow to you, Laura, and your children. In fact, the people of Glamorgan have a part to tell in this tale. So we'll get to that, Laura. Okay, so Edward I has a son called Edward II. And he's not that good at being king. He manages to upset his nobles. And I'm afraid they rebel. And they have him killed, which is very mean. Perhaps the meanest way possible. The rumour is that they put a hot poker up his bum. They probably didn't. It's probably made up. But there you go. I've said hot poker and bum now. Nasty way to go. Anyway, Edward II has a son called Edward III. Now, England has had some land in France before. Henry II we talked about. It did have, after King John lost it all, one tiny bit left called Gascony. And Edward I very much wanted to keep hold of Gascony. So he arranged for his son, Edward II, to marry a member of the French royal family. Her name is Isabel, Queen Isabel, and she's a fierce lady. She reckoned that she would be a better queen than Edward II would be a king, and so she kind of helped to overthrow him, and may even have had something to do with that poker in his bottom. Anyway, she has a son called Edward III. Now, Edward III is regarded as one of England's very best kings. Who knows what criteria you get? Probably lots of wars. Edward III, there's some fun stories about him. England has an order of knights called the Order of the Garter. And those of you who know about such things will know that a garter is a little bit of lace that went round your leg in medieval times to basically keep your pants from falling down. And the story goes that Edward III wanted to think of a new group of knights. He wanted to call them the Knights of the Round Table because Edward III loved stories of King Arthur, which we talked a little bit about in Silly History of England Part 1. Anyway, Edward III goes to this ball and he dances with a lovely lady, a countess, having an old dance, a lovely time, and then the countess's garter, which she hasn't put on properly, falls off her leg and plops to the middle of the dance floor. And everyone starts sniggering behind their hands and chuckling and laughing because you can see the countess's garter. And the poor old countess is absolutely mortified. She's so embarrassed. And everyone starts laughing at her. And Edward III, who is a good and chivalrous king, the perfect knight, says, "Oi, stop laughing at my friend." He picks the garter up from the floor and he puts the garter up on his own leg. And he says, "Shame on those who think it is shameful." And his new group of knights becomes not the Knights of the Round Table, but the Knights of the Garter, the Knights of keeping your pants on. So there you go. And the Knights of the Garter are still a thing today. I think the Prime Minister's just given a load of it out to his mates. There you go. So, I mentioned before, didn't I? Edward III's mum is a French lady, Queen Isabel. Now, in Edward III's reign, the King of France dies. And importantly, he dies without any children to pass the throne on to. And more importantly than that, he doesn't even have any brothers to pass the throne on to. Now, there may be some girls, but unfortunately medieval people are very sexist, as we're about to discover quite a lot over the next 200 years or so. So Isabel says, "I've got my lovely boy Edward. Look at his garter. Isn't he great? Perhaps he would be a good king of France because he's a pretty good king of England as it is." The French go, "No, we're thinking of really, a bit of an inside hire, really, if that's all right." And Isabel goes, "Okay, he's a lovely boy. He's my sweet boy. He's a good boy, little Edward." The French don't have it. They elect a new king. The Count of Valois, the Count of Valois, he becomes king of France. Now, remember Gascony, that one last little bit of English territory in France. Well, in medieval times, the king is at the top of the pyramid. He's in charge of everything. And to make sure that the king knows that you accept that he's in charge, you have to do something called paying homage. Now, in Britain, most of the time, other British rulers in Wales and Scotland and Ireland paid homage to the King of England, England being the biggest country in the British Isles, let's call them for sake of argument. And homage means you bring them a little present and say, "You're in charge." Now, because of William the Conqueror, English knights and English kings have lands in France. And the English knights technically also owe homage to the King of England for their lands in England, but they owe homage to their King of France as well. And technically, as Gascony is a little bit of France, even though it's ruled by England, Edward owes the King of France homage for Gascony. So he has to turn up. He's a king in his own right. He has to turn up with a little present and say, "I'll do whatever you say." Now, usually, he wouldn't have to do whatever you say, but these are the rules. This is how you have to do it. But homage is a really good way of starting trouble between two kingdoms. You might remember in the last episode, Llewellyn the Last, Prince of Wales, was ordered to pay homage to the English king in the middle of winter when he didn't have a chance of getting there in time. And lo and behold, when he didn't turn up, the King of England said, "Right, we're invading Wales." So it's often used as an excuse. So even though the French take Edward's homage for Gascony, they start to say, like, "It's French, really, isn't it? We should be in charge of that. Give it back to us, or we'll have a big war." So Edward goes, "All right, if that's how you want it, if you want Gascony, then I want France, because I have a claim to the throne of France through my mum, Isabel. If it's a fight you want, it is a fight you should get." And Poor old France suffers very badly in this war. It would be petty and stupid to say that they kind of started with this. It's all more complicated than that. Anyway, so the English invade France. And it goes very well initially. They capture the city of Caen, where William the Conqueror was from. It was his capital city. He's actually buried there, in fact. And a lot of the English soldiers have very bad memories of what William the Conqueror did in England. And so they open his tomb up and they chuck his body everywhere just to say, well, there, we got you in the end. Poor old William the Conqueror's funeral was a bit of a nightmare as it was. This is going back a bit, but I may as well tell you. So when William the Conqueror died in a very unpleasant way, he fell forward off his horse and bumped his tummy and popped his tummy basically on the inside. Very slow and nasty way to die basically. But as soon as he died, everyone was so worried about who was going to be king next that they all ran off literally immediately back to their castles to make sure that their castles would stay. And apparently poor old William the Conqueror just left on his bedroom floor, dead. Because of that, it takes a long time to bury him. So he's a little bit past his best. He's gone a little bit whiffy, poor old William the Conqueror. And his body's all swollen up. It won't fit in the coffin that they've made for him. So they have to push the body really, like Weekend at Bernie's, they have to push the body really hard down into the coffin to fit William the Conqueror in. And then they nail the lid down on and they start the service. And in the middle of the service, this guy turns up and says, "This fella owes me money." And the priest says, "It's a bit late for that. This is his funeral." And the fella goes, "Oh, right. Well, I thought I'd better say." And then, because it's been going off for such a long time, William the Conqueror's corpse explodes in his coffin. And the stench of William the Conqueror's popped body causes the priest who's doing the funeral to rush through it with his finger over his nose as fast as he can. So poor old William the Conqueror. That it's nasty, isn't it? So poor old William the Conqueror, yeah. The English soldiers who remember 1066, even though they weren't born, throw some plastic decking furniture around Caen and they vandalise his body and things. Now, next, the English go off into the countryside on what's called a chevauchée. Now, a chevauchée is a horrible thing. It's basically, you get your army out in a big line and you just burn everything. You steal everything, you burn all the crops, you eat all the animals. You just absolutely devastate the country. And the reason they do this is to go, look, the king who's in charge of you isn't much good, is he? Look at all the stuff we're doing. Maybe we should be king instead. Medieval people boggle the mind sometimes. Why they would think this would be a good way to win people over to their cause by setting them on fire and eating all their houses is not... It doesn't stack up. But they do say the past is a different country. Apparently, some people in France thought that Edward III would be, a pretty good king. He seems to know what he's doing. But then he does all this and they're like, we're less keen on this now all of a sudden. Anyway, England is a smaller country than France. France's army is quite a bit bigger than England. And they catch up with the English army at a place called Crécy. Now, the English are outnumbered by the French. French got way more knights than they do. And things are looking pretty grim for Edward III. The reason that the 100 Years' War is remembered and celebrated in England is because of these battles. Because the French get 3 almighty hidings in the 100 Years' War. They win a lot more battles than that. But it's these famous 3 that are remembered in the English-speaking world. Anyway. So the English are completely outnumbered by the French. How do they win? Well, one of the reasons is the longbow. Now, longbows are cool. You won't get any argument from me. Longbows are definitely cool. They have a history to themselves, and there's a lot of stuff that's quite interesting, and a lot of stuff that is still kind of relevant today. So a longbow is it's a big, long bow. They're first encountered in Britain by the Normans because the people of South Wales, Glamorgan, I told you they'd turn up, The people of South Wales are pretty formidable archers. And Wales is much poorer than England. And so when the Normans finish off the Kingdom of England in 1066, within 10 years, they're moving west into Wales. One of the weapons that the Welsh used to stop them is the longbow, because you can hide on the side of a mountain or behind a lovely tree in Wales. And even though you are a very poor person with a lump of wood, you can kill a big rich knight with all chainmail on his horse from a distance without having any bother. And that the longbowmen of Glamorgan are incredible shots. There's a story of this Norman knight who runs over a river, and the Welsh shoot him in the leg, and the arrow goes through his leg, through his chainmail, and pins him to his horse. And he's like, "Oh God!" He runs off the other way, and the Welsh pin the other leg there. So it's not revealed how he got on his horse, but they basically pin him to the horse with arrows, which is not very nice. Hugo, archery lessons. Excellent, yeah. The bowmen of South Wales were formidable soldiers. In fact, Gerald of Wales, who's a historian from the 1200s, said that a Glamorgan archer, a South Walian archer, could shoot a Welsh longbow through several inches of solid oak. So there is a lot of argument. When you go to archery club, hopefully you'll be in one in Wales, so they'll give the Welsh invention of the longbow a little bit more shift. But yes, there he is, yeah, Gerald of Wales. So the Welsh and the English continue for the next 200, 300 years to fight one another. It goes back and forth, basically, slowly but surely. More and more of Wales starts to come into sort of English hands until there is one final kingdom up in the north, Gwynedd of North Wales. And when Edward I invades North Wales, he's a bit like, these bows are a good idea. Maybe we can tweak these a little bit. And basically, when the last kingdom of Wales falls to the English, lots of people in Wales have got no jobs. So they get jobs in the English army, which means the English army becomes full of either Welsh archers or parts of England that use these longbows. And at some point, they change the bows. The bows used to be elm, which is a tough knobbly wood, and they change it to yew. Now, this is going to get very archery nerd at the moment, but the reason that a yew bow is better is because it's got two different kinds of wood. You've got the hard sapwood on the outside. You've got the hardwood on the outside, and you've got the sapwood on the inside, and it forms basically a perfect natural spring, because the hardwood on the outside wants to go back to how it was, straight. The softwood on the inside is easier to bend, so it basically makes a big old spring. And this makes a really powerful bow. They've dug bodies up of what they reckon to be medieval archers, and their shoulders are like overdeveloped. They've got massive, one meaty arm bigger than the other, just like half a Popeye. And the other thing about archers is they are cheaper than knights. In medieval times, knights owe their allegiance and their service to the king, but only for 2 weeks or a couple of months at a time. And if the king wants them to fight for any longer than that, you've got to put your hand in your wallet. The thing about archers is you don't have to pay as much. They don't have horses, some of them, which take less money, and also you just pay them and they turn up. They're not going to argue because that's their job. And this is kind of how European armies start. Anyway, so we get to the Battle of Crecy. There is an almighty... I need to tell you about archery surnames beforehand as well. So, the longbow became very successful for the English army. At first, against the Scottish, possibly the Welsh. But there's probably... The thing is about fighting Wales back in the day is there were loads of Welshmen fighting for England at this point. Anyway, loads of surnames in England are to do with this practice of archery. Archer, for example, is the surname of an archer. Bowyer is the surname of a bowmaker. Fletcher is the surname of someone who makes the feathers on the end of the arrow. Arrowsmith is someone who makes the arrow. So it becomes like a real industry. People making arrows, people making feathers for the arrows, people forging arrowheads for the arrows, people making the bows, people importing the bows, because lots of this yew that they started making young bows out of came from Italy and Germany. And in fact, at one point, the Germans had to say, we need to stop sending the English so much yew. We haven't got any left. So archery and longbows becomes very important to England in general. And this is why. At the Battle of Crecy, completely outnumbered by the French, the English/Welsh, the longbowmen we'll call them, put up an almighty fight against the French. Their arrows are accurate enough to hit the French from miles away. They're so good at shooting, they've been training since childhood. They can shoot 12 arrows a minute. And most of these arrows are going to go through the chainmail of the French and even some of the plate mail as well. So it doesn't matter how many knights the French have got. It's very difficult to run into this arrow storm. And even if these French knights aren't killed by arrows, the strength of this longbow, you could like 180 pounds worth of longbow, which is... I wrote in one of our silly history scripts that getting hit with a longbow arrow is like getting hit by 2 Labradors at 100 miles an hour. That's the force of it. So even if it doesn't break your armour, it's like being hit by a sledgehammer. Very disorientating. And the French have crossbows, and they have some Italians from Genoa who have crossbows. There's all sorts of stories that the Italians got their strings wet in the rain beforehand. The longbowmen put their strings in their hats so they were dry. So the Italian crossbows didn't work. They couldn't shoot as fast. They couldn't shoot as far. And the English longbowmen, now I'm doing it, just had them for tea. We don't know that for definite. What's entirely possible is that the Italians turned up and go like, we can't hit these guys. Our strings are wet. And they shoot a few volleys off. Then the English longbowmen, damn it, run in, shoot some arrows at them. The Italians go, we're off. And then the French go, cowards, traitors, let's kill them all. So the French go in and kill all these poor crossbowmen. Anyway, the French are mightily defeated in the Battle of Crecy. And Edward III takes loads and loads of French land. And everyone in England is very happy. Very happy indeed. And England win what I'm going to describe as the first phase of the Wars of the Roses, and that is our first break. Right, let's have a look at the comments, shall we? Right up to the very top. Yeah, it was whiffy. Prudence. I presume this is poor old Billy the Conqueror's explosive body. And yes, Laura, history is gruesome, and we're going to get to it. Yeah, that's right, Prudence. Yeah, maybe you've seen the same documentary as I have, Blood Red Roses. The Field of Towton is a very haunting documentary. I was taken to the Battlefield of Towton by the City History Boys for my birthday. There's a video on Facebook if you'd like to see it. Laura Lee, my dad is an archer, and my brother. Wowee. And yes, and Giraldius Cambrasius, thank you, Laura. The correct name for Gerald of Wales. I got a book on Gerald of Wales. I keep meaning to read it. Husband is an archery coach. Well, we'll have to see how many mistakes I made in my stream of consciousness. He talked about Aerosmith, but didn't sing any of the classics. We're here for history, not loving elevators, Uncle Bilbo. All right, one more sip of lime-flavoured dishwater, and then we'll crack on. 34 minutes. Okay, well, half an hour, we'll take that. All right, so we now move on to phase 2 of the 100 Years' War, which is the bit that we do not talk about in England. As silly history boys, we go to lots of castles where there tends to be a certain type of man, and there is always a man of a certain age, with his tummy hanging over his chainmail, going, how we really battered the French in the 100 Years' War. And we're here to tell you the bit that they have no interest in. Because you may have noticed that King Charles of England in modern days is not King of France. So you can roughly see how this is going to go. Anyway, phase 2. Phase 2 is largely done on the English side by Edward III's son, Edward the Black Prince. Now, funny enough, I am wearing his symbol today. If you can't see, then I have the 3 feathers of the Welsh Rugby Union. At the Battle of Crecy, Edward the Black Prince fought against the soldiers of King John of Bohemia, who was blind but still wanted to fight. And Edward was so impressed by John of Bohemia's bravery that he took his symbol of the feathers and his motto, Ich dien, I serve, and took that to be his personal coat of arms when he was jousting. Because Edward the Black Prince loved jousting. I learnt some facts about Edward the Black Prince in the job that me and the silly boys have just done. We went to Leeds Armouries for the International Easter Joust, where England and Scotland as a team, Italy and France, jousted at each other in real life. And yeah, I don't know if Uncle Bilbo agreed with me, but I thought it was really cool. Uncle Bilbo was so unhappy about it that he broke my ribs in a hilarious incident. They're fine. They are still sore. I haven't lifted any weights or done any jogging like I wanted to. Anyway, yeah. Go see Grandma. Give her my love. And there'll be a Silly History of England Part 3, Prue, so don't worry about it. We ain't going to do it all now. Anyway, yeah, so Edward the Black Prince, he loved jousting. He's in A Knight's Tale with Heath Ledger. He's the one that Heath Ledger jousts him, even though he knows he's king. So that's pretty cool. But he did love jousting. He was horrible, though. The second phase of the 100 Years' War consists mostly of Edward the Black Prince just going around France and just setting it on fire again. And people wonder why the French didn't want the kings of England to be their king. He does do one more thing, though, is this the Battle of Poitiers. And as usual, the English get cornered by a much bigger French army. I should say it's an English army with people from Gascony. Remember Gascony? They're there too. And probably a load of Taffs, a load of Welsh people as well. But as usual, England gets cornered by the French. They have much less men. They're in a very bad position. Through a mixture of longbows, a hedge. The English hide on one side of the hedge and leave a gap. And the French go, we'll just go all through this gap. And they're getting longbow from one side, and the English knights are hitting them with blunt objects and things. And the French knights just make an absolute mess of it. And this happens again later on, that the French have got the English exactly where they want them. And they're so keen to just get in there and start beating up these people who've been setting their country on fire that they just mess it up. Bless them. The thing about the second phase of the 100 Years' War is, although you have the Battle of Crecy, the Battle of Poitiers, where the King of France is captured by Edward the Black Prince. Now, his name is Jean II, John II of France. He's described as being a soft Ouija boy. So, yeah. Not this again. Right. Sorry. Stop distracting me, you horrid rib breaker. Anyway. Yeah. So Jean II is captured by the English. Apparently he fights valiantly to stop them getting hold of him. But eventually this English knight wrestles him to the ground, lifts his visor up and says, "Hello, I'm from Artois. Shall I take you to Edward the Black Prince?" And the French king probably go, "Oh, go on then." So he takes him to the Black Prince, who's very nice to the king. Or so the chronicles say anyway. Apparently, Edward the Black Prince gives him a big feast, has him a big tea cooked, and doesn't sit down all night. Because he's like, look, you're king. You're very brave in the battle. You are a prisoner, but I'm still going to be nice to you. At some point, poor old Edward the Black Prince contracts dysentery and poos himself to death. People always poo themselves to death in history. John II of France gets locked up in England until they pay his ransom. John II's ransom is 3 times the yearly income of the Kingdom of France. It's like it took a lot of cheddar off them. Anyway, John II goes back to France, and the French don't pay the ransom. So he's like, well, I'm going to have to go back now. So he goes back, he does the honourable thing, he goes back, and then he does the convenient thing for the French, and he just drops dead. And that is the second phase of the 100 Years' War over. All right, Eddie the Black Prince now dies. Now, the reason the 100 Years' War lasts such a long time is that it's not 116 years of constant scrapping and bickering. There's several big gaps. And here's a big gap now, partly for the Black Death, the plague that devastates the populations of Europe. People are too ill to fight. I've got to stay in with the plague. I really can't. So there's a bit of a gap. But while there's a gap for the plague, let's go back to some more complicated history. Now, Edward III, King of England, he had 5 sons. One of them, his heir to the throne, Edward the Black Prince, has now pooed himself to death. He has several other sons. He has Lionel of Antwerp. He also has a son called John of Gaunt. He's Duke of Lancaster. Let's call that the House of Lancaster. He has another son called Edmund of Langley, the Duke of York. Let's call his family the House of York. Lancaster and York. That will become significant. Now, Edward III, because he'd had a lot, his relatives, his past kings, had all kinds of problems with their barons. Now, Edward III had been very clever because he said, like, let's go to war with France and take all their stuff. And while you're in a war or a long history job, everyone rubs together very nicely because they're in danger, they share peril and things. They also have lots of larks around the campfire eating big dripping lengths of meat and things like that. So having a war, if you're a medieval king, is a really good way of keeping your nobles as your friends. But Edward III goes a bit further than that, and he sorts it so the 5 most powerful people in England are his sons. And they're not going to do anything against him. They're his sons. It will become a problem. Because, of course, the heir to the throne, Edward the Black Prince, has died. So who's king now? Is it one of these brothers? Is it John of Gaunt? Is it Edmund of Langley? Is it Lionel of Antwerp? It's not. They decide that the Black Prince's little son, Richard, is going to be king next. So he is crowned Richard II. Now, this we have covered in the Silly History of England. Forgotten how to talk. This is covered in the Silly History of England Part 1. But it suffices to say that Richard II is a jerk and no one likes him. The people of England don't like him. They rebel as part of the Peasants' Revolt because they're fed up with being taxed to pay for wars. They're also fed up of having the Black Death, and they're also fed up with being peasants and being at the bottom of the pile. He also upsets the nobility. In particular, John of Gaunt's son, Henry Bolingbroke, who succeeds his dad as Earl of Lancaster. And Richard II is so unpopular that Henry Bolingbroke kidnaps him, locks him up in a room, and doesn't feed him. Poor old Richard II, very quietly, is starved to death in, I think, Pontefract Castle, which we'll get on to later on. So, the Crown of England is kind of changed hands from the Plantagenet family to this sort of like Lancaster-y family. Now, being King of England isn't easy. And the fact that Henry Bolingbroke stole the crown off Richard II starts causing a lot of problems. And it starts making problems that are already there worse. Up in the north of England, there's a lovely place called Scotland. And because of the film Braveheart and Outlander and Rob Roy, the people of Scotland would have you believe that Scotland, for many hundreds of years, has just sat there quietly being bullied by England. It's not really true. as soon as England has a war with France, the Scots are like straight away raiding England, and the French encourage them to do that. And so this is, at this point now, this is really where England and Scotland really start getting nasty with each other. And there's a family up north called the Percys, and they help defend the north of England from the Scots, but they're supposed to get paid for it. And Henry IV, Henry Bolingbroke, doesn't pay them to do it, so the Percys are cross. There's also, over in God's country, in Wales, a fella called Owain Glyndŵr, and he's fed up with how he is treated as a member of the Welsh nobility, so he starts a rebellion. And then you have the Mortimers, who are English lords on the edge of Wales, and they have a claim to the throne. They're fed up with Henry IV as well, so they rebel. Now, so Henry IV is pretty unlucky with all of this, but he is very lucky in his son. Prince Hal, his son, Henry Jr., is a very good soldier, and he helps put down the rebellion of the Percys, the rebellion of Owain Glyndŵr, and the rebellion of the Mortimers as well. He's in a play. It's called Henry V. There's Henry V Part 1. Well, there's Henry IV Part 1 and Part 2, and then Henry V is like the sequel to both. But he's one of Shakespeare's heroes, and that's why we kind of remember Henry V as a very sexy king, very young, very dynamic. I mentioned last time, poor geezer only had half a face, because while fighting the Percy family at the Battle of Shrewsbury, he wanted to have a proper look of the battle. He got hit in the face with an arrow. It could have killed him. But I went to Sherwood Forest a few years ago, and a very clever man, who I think's got a YouTube channel, basically told the big crowd of history nerds how they saved Henry V's face. And basically, you pack it with honey. If you never have a sore throat or anything like that, Manuka honey in particular, but honey is a natural antiseptic. So they filled poor old Prince Henry's face with honey to stop the infection. But the thing is, it'll only go so far. So someone has to get the honey out and change the honey. And apparently the best way to do this is to suck the honey out of the face and spit it out. So that was someone's job, to fill the king's son's face with honey and then suck it out again with a straw or not. I don't know. Whatever happened, it worked. They saved him. They saved his life. It is reckoned that he was not classically handsome, that probably one side of his face would have been, horribly scarred by this terrible wound. Anyway, so Henry V is king now, because, Henry IV died, maybe of leprosy, and Henry V becomes king. All those rebellions he had is like, look, let's be friends. Everyone's pardoned, so everyone gets brought back into the fold again. Apart from Owain Glyndŵr, who is, even to this day, still on the run. Never captured, never found out what happened to him. That's a story for another day. So, Henry V is King of England. He's inherited a very unstable crown. All those rebellions, all those nobles, all this hassle. And then, the King of France is not very well. When I say not very well, his face has not collapsed. He's not pooing himself to death. He has a really severe mental illness. And he begins to change. One morning he gets up and says, right, we're going to get some traitors. And his men are like, what, where? They're like, come on, let's go, get these traitors. So they wandering off into the country, going to some random castle. They get outside the castle, and King Charles, the King of France, goes, right, let's get him, draws his sword, just starts whacking his mates, kills a guy. They eventually wrestle him to the ground, and get him inside and things. But his illness gets worse and worse. He has, I believe it's something that people still have, he believes he's made of glass. He's terrified of touching people in case he shatters completely. And he has iron rods sewn into his clothes to make him more structurally sound. Now, as medieval people, very kind, very considerate, Henry V goes, he's mad! Let's get him! So England invades France. Henry V begins with the siege of Harfleur, which is a port in the north of France. And he spends loads of money on a dead good army. They've got cannons, all that. They've got loads of longbowmen. The longbowmen have got horses. It's a very small army. It's very well equipped. And the siege of Harfleur is an absolute disaster. The French fight incredibly well. They don't give up. Eventually, the English army digs under the walls of Harfleur and collapses the walls on top of them. But it takes months. And while they're doing it, all the soldiers in the English army start pooing themselves to death. Whenever there is a big concentration of people in medieval times, often you get the pooing yourself disease, dysentery. So it gets to sort of winter time. The English have taken Harfleur, but they're absolutely at the end of their tether. Half of them have pooed themselves inside out. The other half are exhausted from fighting. So it's been an absolute disaster. They've spent all this money trying to conquer this tiny bit of France, which is barely worth it. So Henry V does something very kingish. He says, right, we're not staying here. We're gonna march through France to prove that we can. Presumably, as everyone else is like, we've all got some. I've got no more pairs of underpants left. I've lost a lot of weight through the dysentery. I'm looking trim, but I'm looking, gaunt and things. Henry's like, no, we're going out there. We're going to show the French we're not scared of them. And so, in the middle of winter, Henry takes what men are fit enough to march and just goes through a stroll through France. And the French are like, all right then. So the French follow them to a little village called Agincourt. Now, partly because of the Shakespeare play, and partly because of the sort of story of this battle, this has become probably the most famous English victory, spoilers, the English win, in the 100 Years' War. Now, this is the myth. A tiny English army, miles from home, everyone pooing themselves, against a hugely superior French force. And through bravery, courage, everyone sticking together, and longbows, the English just shoot down the arrogant French with their longbows, even though they're dying of dysentery and they're exhausted, and the English win a magnificent victory. Now, this is partly true. However, you may remember that I said that longbows could go through chainmail. That was 200 years ago. That's in the past. People don't really wear hardly any chainmail anymore. They wear full suits of plate armour, which is incredibly tough. We just went and watched the jousts at Leeds Armories, and it was amazing. And they had armour made in the same way as the Marshal of Ceremonies said. It's historic armour. It's made in the same way, but it's not old. So we were watching literally horses riding at each other with a big, going at 30 miles an hour. It's the best part of, between the weight of the knight and the weight of the horse, it's the best part of, let's say, half a ton each. And all the force goes to the point of that lance. And you watch, it's incredible. My point is, longbow arrows aren't going through that anymore. And there's lots of videos on YouTube, or YouTube, like a U-bow, you can watch it, of modern archers just pumping arrow after arrow into this plate mail. And it just pings off. There's no way that all the French knights died of arrows at Agincourt. What you can say, though, is people have done some research into it since. They've actually gone to the field of Agincourt and got some of the soil. And it's a nightmare. It makes the worst mud imaginable. And before the Battle of Agincourt, there was an almighty rainstorm. And there's all this mud. And as usual, the French cannot wait to get at the English. They've got them outnumbered. They're finally going to get some revenge for all the defeats that they've inflicted. And the French are too eager. So, almost without a word of command, the French army goes forward first. And they start shooting these longbows at them. Now, even if the longbows don't go through the armour, like I said, getting hit with a longbow arrow is like getting hit with a sledgehammer. So the people on the front row are like, oh my God, this is awful. This is like getting hit by a sledgehammer, 12 times every minute. And it's a nightmare. And then you've got the people at the back who don't know what's going on, going like, come on, let's get at these. And it seems that what maybe happened at Agincourt is the French got stuck in the mud and basically walked over the top of their mates. It's a really... History's awful. Anyway, the long and the short of it is the English win the Battle of Agincourt. The French lose the Battle of Agincourt, and it's like a national disaster. They lose so many knights, so many lords. The Constable of France, one of the best fighters, is killed. And in all the French manuscripts afterwards, they refer to Agincourt as the unfortunate day, which is, yeah, one way of putting it. Anyway, so 55. Let's call that a gap. Let's go back through these comments. So Henry V has won the Battle of Agincourt. Before we go to the comments, we'll say that he conquers more of France than anyone has ever before. It's basically the whole of northern France that Henry V conquers. And he goes to the French king and says, look, you hand it over. And the French king's like, I'm made of glass. And Henry's like, no, hand it over. And the French nobles say, well, listen, you can marry Catherine of Valois, the king's daughter, and the king's son won't be king anymore. You'll be king when the king dies. And Henry says, yeah, I'll take that. So that is how the third phase of the 100 Years' War wins, with the English way on top. Right, let's whiz back a minute. Yeah, I am complaining about you breaking my ribs again. Yes, and we're not allowed to take the Lord's name in vain. Theatre of Science said so. It's good for the Alvarin. Yes, Black Death, name of my band in college, Tombo. You missed Harry Robinson, King of England and Neighbours as late resident, loving the CCs. Tombo, thanks Uncle Bilbo. I'm sorry for missing out Harry Robinson. Tombo works at Pontefract Castle. He worked there. There we go. The Theatre of Science are off to karate. That's all right. Yeah. It's yeah, Helen. It's not nice, mate. It's awful. Yeah. There we go. Luna. Yeah, he may have had schizophrenia. It sounds like it from what people wrote about it. It's hard to say, but maybe he did. Yeah. Anyway, so Henry V's way on top. Okay. So yeah, Henry V is way on top. When the King of France dies, he's going to be king. The King of France's son, the Dauphin, heir to the throne, he ain't going to be King of France anymore. Unfortunately for Henry V, he dies before the King of France. So his son, Henry VI, becomes King of England, and he's going to be King of France next. But the French aren't too happy about that. In fact, there's two little camps in the French side. There's one set of French nobles that say, nah, our French prince, the Dauphin, he should be king. And the English are like, no, you signed a treaty, man. And France's neighbour on the other side, Burgundy, is like, nah, you signed that treaty, man. You got to let the English be king. By the way, we're friends with the English, and we don't like the French. So there's this argument, and Henry VI, who's a baby at this point, so the country's being run by his advisors, and his advisors are like, right, let's go and get the rest of France. Now, the French prince, the heir to the throne, originally the Dauphin, is the Duke of a French city called Orléans. So the English and the Burgundians go, right, Orléans or bust. So they all go down to take Orléans off the French. They lay siege to it. They start battering it with cannons and things. And the siege is not going well. A Scottish army turns up from Scotland with a load of food for the city. And joins forces with the French army. And the Scots are like, right, let's go and get the Sassenachs. Let's go and get the English. And the French are like, it'd be cool. Like, these have given us some hidings in the past. We need to, make sure it's all cool. The Scots are like, no, we're going in there. And the Scots get mown down by the Longbowmen as usual. And the English steal all the food for Orleans. So Orleans in a terrible state. It's going to have to surrender. And when Orleans surrenders, that's it for France. But it's not, is it? Because in the little village of Domremy, a very young girl, some say as young as 14 years old, named Jeanne d'Arc, or Joan of Arc, starts hearing voices. And she says they are the voices of God and the saints, who tell her, the English need to get out of France now. We give you permission as God to go and get rid of them. And the first thing you got to do is make sure that the Dauphin, the Crown Prince of France, doesn't give up. So she turns up at this French army base or garrison or whatever and says, take me to the prince. And they're like, why? And there's like, I've got a message from God. And they're like, oh, okay. Well, nothing else has worked. Maybe God might change his mind, because there is a prophecy that the Treaty of Troyes that was signed by Henry V and the King of France to give Henry the crown. There is a prophecy that the Treaty of Troyes will be destroyed by a maid, and Joan of Arc is indeed a maid. So they go to where the Crown Prince of France, the Dauphin, is encamped with his army, hoping to raise the siege of Orleans. And they're like, this lady's here from God. And he's like, all right, well, I've heard some wild stuff in the past. If she's really from God, then she'll know who I am if she has a message for me from God. So he puts his fancy dress costume on. He puts some googly eyes on, little rubber nose, big hat pulled down. And he dresses his mate up in the robes of state, puts the little coronet of the Dauphin on his head, says, right, you play me for half an hour and see if this girl really is from God. And Joan of Arc turns up, looks at the Dauphin's mate and says, you're not the Crown Prince. This geezer is. And they're like, oh my God! She is from God! And the French army starts to take heart that maybe their luck has changed. And they go to Orleans. Joan of Arc, it is said, leads them, dressed in armour, with a great flag of... Joan of Arc doesn't actually fight, but she has a big war banner which she waves in the air and says, come on, boys, let's do them. This is for Crécy, this is for Agincourt, this is for Poitiers. And the French go for it. They chuck the English out of Orleans. They chase them all the way up the Loire Valley, out of France. Oh, not completely out of France, but they chase them a fair bit back. And next of all, Joan says to the Dauphin, you're the rightful king of France. We need to get you crowned king. But the French kings traditionally get crowned in Rouen, which is a city in France, which the English have got hold of at the moment. And so they're like, well, we can't really risk that. And Joan's like, you're going to be king. We're going to Rouen. So they go. And they beat the English in the Battle of Patay on the way, which we never learn about in English schools. But what happens is that the English look to ambush Joan of Arc's army. The Longbowmen are all hidden in the woods, ready to do the French as they walk by. And then one of the Longbowmen, probably an English one, not a Welsh one, sees a stag and goes, dinner! And the French, who are walking past, see an arrow come out of the wood and if it was a Welsh archer, he hit the deer. If it was an English archer, he missed. But they're like, the English are in there. So they ride around the back of them and do them. And that's the Battle of Patay. They go to Rouen. The Dauphin is crowned King of France. It's all coming up, Joan of Arc. The problem is that Joan is very, very popular with the soldiers. She's probably more popular than the Dauphin. And he gets a bit twitchy about this because he is king after all. Even though his relatives have been so utterly hopeless in getting rid of the English. And it's taken a 14-year-old girl to say to a knight, to a lord, come on, do better. So anyway, Joan is persuaded by some of the other French nobles to try and take Paris back off the English, which is still deep in English hands. All of this is covered in 3 Times Into the Fire, the definitive story of Joan of Arc in the Silly History Boys show. But Joan's army is defeated at Paris, and the Dauphin, or the king as we must call him now, warns her. They're like, listen, don't go nuts. Don't do anything like that again without my permission. And Joan apparently says, I don't need your permission. I come from God. He's more important than you. So things get a little bit edgy between the Dauphin, or the king as he now is, and Joan. And trying to take another city, this time off the Burgundians, who are allies of the English. Joan falls off her horse, or is knocked off her horse, and she's captured by the Burgundians, who sell her to the English. And this is a sad bit, because the English can't accept that God wants them out of France, which is what Joan of Arc is saying. So they say the voices that she heard were not from God. They were from evil things, devils and whatnot. And they put her on trial for heresy. And the punishment for heresy, if they find you guilty, is burning at the stake. So they get all these really clever priests and bishops and theologians in to try and trip Joan of Arc up on what she says. And we won't go too far into it because it's a bit sad, but a girl who doesn't read or write, or doesn't have all this, university education, whatever, runs rings around these prosecutors, and they ask her questions to try and make her say things that will make her seem bad, and she outwits them at every turn. And in the end, the only thing they can get Joan of Arc on is that she wore men's clothes, because she, as in her own words more or less, she was a soldier. And so she didn't want to wear a nice frock with sparkles on. It would get mucky and whatnot. So poor old Joan of Arc is found guilty and burnt at the stake. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. Because Joan of Arc is such an enormous figurehead for the French, who had some rum times against the English. The English basically wanted to make an example of her, so they burnt at the stake. If it makes you feel any better, people who are burnt at the stake are not burnt alive. They're very gently strangled beforehand, so it's not quite so bad. We'll see how many people that loses us. This is history. History is horrible. So they burn Joan of Arc, and then they sweep the ashes back into a dustpan and brush, and they burn them again. And they just change the crowd in the square, and then they sweep the ashes back again, and they burn them once more. Now, this cheeses the French off something fierce. They are very cross that the English killed Joan of Arc, and they spend the next 20, 30 years wiping the floor with the English and driving them out of France until there is only the tiny port of Calais left. Oh, and Gascony. Gascony's always still there until it's not. So we move on to our break. Oh, wow. So that was... What time did I start? So an hour and 10 minutes, and I've only done the 100 Years' War. All right. Let's have some questions, eh? Right. Here we go. Here we go. So, physical science, soft karate. Goodbye. Is there a hilarious joke about the Dauphin? Yes. Dolphin-friendly tuna. There is. If Uncle Bilbo or Tombo is prepared to put the hilarious joke about dolphin-friendly tuna in the chat, then I'd be very grateful. Theatre of Science is gone. Helena Roger Ashworth, thank you for filling a gap in my regards history. Your husband, who's half French, might know more about this period in time. Well, hopefully that's filled in any gaps. Wow. Gloria, Uncle Bilbo's long-suffering life partner, Joan of Arc was a heroine when she was younger. There's something that Mark Twain, the famous American writer, said about Joan of Arc. And it's like, whatever he wrote, whatever we may consider great, we must look to Joan of Arc as an example, because she's incredibly brave, whatever sort of happened with her. Theatre of Science, that was my sister, Joan of Arc. Wow. Here's Heresy. I love that band. Yeah, smiling class before she started harassing Labour MPs on daytime television. Uncle Bilbo does not want to do the Dauphin joke. All right, okay, so we have made our way through the 100 Years' War. We've been going for 1 hour, and we've had lots of nice comments and things. But I really think, hearsay, that's what he's going on with. I don't know. I'm half tempted to jump on another day and do Wars of the Roses. Can you imagine that I actually got from the Romans all the way through to Henry V in an hour and a half? I've only just about managed to do the 100 Years' War in an hour and 10 minutes. It's very complicated, my friends. It's like a jumper. It's all connected to each other. But yeah, the reason we do these videos is partly because I enjoy doing them, and partly because even Uncle Bilbo knows bits of history. But it's all about, these videos are all about maybe connecting those little bits of knowledge that we may have to each other, basically. Yeah. Dense history mind. Named my band in college. It's true. I won't take it back. I never will. Right, cool. Any questions of what we've just done? Or shall I go and have a jolly time? And perhaps we'll do Silly History of England Part 3, Wars of the Roses, another night. Do an early evening one with bum jokes and fireworks. Am I not allowed to talk about bums on these? I mean, I'm going to do it anyway, History is history, man. Nature raw in tooth and claw. But yeah, we will do Wars of the Roses, and we'll carry on into the Tudors, and maybe into the Stuarts as well. And then there's an enormous gap, and then we get to pirates, and I can probably raffle that off quite well. And then we'll have another gap, and then we'll get to Napoleon, and I'm all right on Napoleon. And then we'll get to the World Wars, and I'm not doing them because they're too sad. Listen, I'm going to call that a day for the Silly History of England Part 2. We'll let you know when the Silly History of England Part 3 is about to drop. If you enjoyed the way that this nonsense was delivered, then you can consult the Silly History Boys show, which is a very good and very silly podcast all about history. We don't go from period to period. We go from whatever we fancy next. Pirates, samurai, knights, the history of tea. We just do what we like, really, because we enjoy it, and that is the main thing. Thank you very much, Theatre of Science. Thank you very much, dear sweet Uncle Bilbo. Righto. Listen, have a lovely Friday, and I'll see you again for the Silly History of England Part 3. Back in the Habit.